This week is a rebroadcast of one of my favorite episodes from 2019. How are you planning for your 100-year life with Andrew Scott? I am releasing this episode the week after the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday. Rather than not publishing an episode, I thought I'd dig back into the archives and rebroadcast one of the most impactful episodes of 2019. If you listened to this episode 3 years ago, I suggest you listen to it again. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 298 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. This week is a rebroadcast of one of my favorite episodes from 2019. How are you planning your 100-year life with Andrew Scott? I'm releasing this episode the week after the Thanksgiving holiday. Rather than not publishing an episode, I thought I'd dig back into the archives and rebroadcast one of the most impactful episodes of 2019. If you listened to this episode 3 years ago, I suggest you listen to it again. Andrew published The 100-Year Life, Living and Working in an Age of Longevity. He is also the author of the nextavenue.org post titled, Is 75 the New 65? How the Definition of Aging is Changing. The book, The 100-Year Life, is about our expectations of how life might look like when we regularly live to 100 years old. He does this by discussing 3 different scenarios. Jack, born in 1945, has a typical 3-stage life: education, work, and retirement. He retired at 62, but passed away at 70. He is married, but his wife is a homemaker. Jimmy, born in 1971, has a life expectancy of 85. He planned for a 3-stage life, but work had to be extended. He has an extended 3-stage life. He is married, but wife makes less money than himself. Jane, born in 1998, has a life expectancy of 100. She will likely not be able to retire until she's 85. This 3-stage life breaks. She probably does not get her first professional job until she's 30, marries later, but to someone who has equal earning power. And they each take breaks from their careers every decade or so to reinvent. This is a fascinating topic, as the traditional retirement age of 65 does not work when many will live to 100 or even longer. We are all living longer. Even though this was recorded prior to the pandemic, the points that Andrew Scott makes about what it means to get older are still extremely relevant. The article, Is 75 the New 65? How the Definition of Aging is Changing, is how a 75-year-old today has the life expectancy of a 65-year-old of 40 years ago. You can think of this in a way that you've been granted 10 more years of life. What are you going to do with it? I think our conversation is even more relevant today as the pandemic is getting us to reevaluate what we are doing and what we want to do with our lives. Let me read Andrew's bio. Andrew Scott is a professor of economics at the London Business School. His research, writing, and talks focus on the macro trends that shape the global environment, from technology, longevity, and globalization through to interest rates and exchange rates. His work on longevity emphasizes the positive impact of the longevity dividend. It isn't just that there are more old people, but how we are aging is changing. Andrew's 2016 book, The 100-Year Life, on this theme became an award-winning global bestseller, translated into 15 languages. He has been an advisor to a range of corporates and governments on a broad range of economic issues, and an award-winning public speaker, combining insight, clarity, humor, and a motivation to action for anyone who hears him. Rather than the usual promotion for the Career Pivot community, let's get right to my discussion with Andrew Scott. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. Today I have Andrew Scott, is the author of The 100-Year Life, one of my favorite books. Andrew, thank you for agreeing to be on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
My pleasure, Mark. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I reached out to you after I read the article on nextavenue.org. Is 75 the new 65? How the definition of aging is changing. Chronological age doesn't mean what it used to and why it matters. Given I've had a whole series of authors on the podcast recently, like Ashton Applewhite and Patty Temple Rocks and Chris Farrell, all talking about ageism, I thought this would be a good segue to discuss more about aging and not ageism.
Yeah, and of course the two are related. It's. I think basically we got in a bit of a mess about the concept of age, and I tackled this a little bit with the 100-Year Life. But the more I look at the topic, the more I realize just how confused we are. The first thing is we always think about aging as end of life, but of course aging just means you're getting older, and if you measure age chronologically, then everyone's aging at exactly the same rate, 1 year every year. But, the way I got into this whole topic as an economist of longevity was the following. So I'm a macroeconomist. I look at future trends that shape the world around us, things like technology and globalization and sustainability. And I used to give a lecture on demographic change and the aging society. And I just came across this problem because the key fact at the individual level is, on average, we're living longer and healthier lives. But at an aggregate level, every government talks about an aging society and we can't afford to get old and how there won't be enough workers and Social Security is going to run out because of the demands on pension and healthcare. And I was trying to work out how you take this individual good news, we are on average living longer and are healthier for longer, and turn it into aggregate bad news. And then I realized what the problem was. There's two things happening. The first is there's more old people. As the birth rate declines and people live for longer, the average citizen is older. And that's what everyone tends to focus on. But the real interesting and exciting thing that's happening is that on average, we're aging differently. We are, in essence, younger for longer. And you see that in lots of different ways. One is things like mortality rates. So you said, 75, the new 65. For the UK and US, a 78-year-old today has the same mortality rate as a 65-year-old from 40 years ago. So in that sense, yes, 78 is the new 65. But if you look at things like the rate of morbidities, arthritis, mobility, living independence, in general, we're averaging better. But because we just look at chronological age, we don't notice that. We don't look at the other measures of aging, if you like, biological age. And that was sort of what got me into the 100-Year Life topic.
Yeah, so it's rather interesting because I am turned 63 next month, and I've looked back at my father, who was almost 40 when I was born. 63 to him was very different than my life now at 63. And the fact that my father was an economist for the New York Stock Exchange, and he was essentially kicked out right before his 60th birthday. And that almost killed it. It took 15 years, but it did kill him. And life just kind of passed on. And sorry, I'm not letting life pass on.
Yeah, and there's a couple of ways of looking at that. So if I may, I talked about chronological age, and that, of course, measures how many years you are since you were born. But if we can be a little bit slightly somber, mortality risk is, in a way, how many years until you die. And if you look at the average American today, they've never been older in a chronological sense, but they've actually never been younger than this decade because their average mortality rate is lower. So it's not clear to me you can say the average American is older. They've got more candles on the birthday cake, as it were, but they've got a lot more years to go. And I think that's the key thing, really. At whatever age you are, because on average we're living these longer lives, and I stress on average because not everyone is, everyone's got to be more forward-looking. And the challenge we've got is in the 20th century, we created a life based on a 70-year life expectancy. We created a 3-stage life of education, work, and retirement. And that then creates a sociological sense of age, what you should be doing at a certain age. And that's, I think, where the ageism comes from that you talked about at the beginning. Because partly corporates think this is what people of a certain age should be doing, unaware of the biological changes. But of course, we also follow our own social norms. And we say, well, this is what we should be doing given the age I'm at. But in a world where the average age of the Rolling Stones is 7 or 8 years older than the average age of the US Supreme Court, we kind of really need to change our sociological norms as well. And that's what I think is so interesting about your site, Next Avenue. It's a bunch of people who are saying, you know what, I'm experimenting. Just as the 20th century created teenagers and created pensioners and retirees, so we are responding to these longer lives by experimenting. And that's kind of exciting.
I know it was in your book or another book I recently read about the fact that the concept of being a teenager is a relatively new concept.
I found this fascinating in working for the books. I did a lot of research on it. And I think it's something like the New Yorker in 1937 kind of first publicly uses the word teenager. And it's not really until the 1950s it becomes established. Previously, we just had children, and then we had adults, and you became an adult at 12, 13, or 14. But if I can, I think let's go back to the sense of chronological age, because I think this is what's really interesting. I think is, I said earlier we got a bit confused about age and ageism. For me, one of the interesting things, if you look through the history of humanity, is for most of our history, people have not known how old they are. They didn't know when they were born. And so they didn't know what day they were born or what year they were born. So most people haven't known their age. So throughout most of human history, if you said to someone how old they were, they'd give it to the nearest 5 or 10 years. Or they'd really sort of say, well, I'm kind of fit and healthy, or I'm a grandfather, or I'm a mother. But they wouldn't know their chronological age. And so we had a much more real sense of age. Starting in the 19th century, you get governments starting to keep accurate birth records. And a bunch of things happen from that. The first is, again, in the 20th century, not just you get teenagers, but you get the celebration of birthdays and birthday parties. And even the song Happy Birthday, I think, is invented in the 1930s. Again, for most of human history, we just didn't celebrate birthdays because most people didn't know when they were born. But the other thing, once governments start to keep a record of people's chronological age, they start to segregate people by age. So, you leave school at 14 or 16 or whatever their rules are. And of course, the greatest example of this is retirement, which is at 65 you are old. And that led to this age segregation and also a big reliance upon chronological age. And, I think what's happening right now is that because we're living these longer, healthier lives, that sense of being old chronologically at 65 just doesn't make sense anymore. But of course, the other thing about aging is people age differently. And so as more and more people reach 65 and beyond, you're also seeing this great diversity in how healthy and active people are. And that, I think, is part of the experimentation, but also the other thing that makes these stereotypes so frustrating.
Yeah, it's interesting. After I moved here, Dahihik, and I'm living at 5,000 feet now, and there's an 8,000-foot mountain just directly behind me. And there's a hiking club here, and there are 80-year-olds who kick my butt going up and down there. And and they look at life differently than I would have thought an 80-year-old would have looked like. And a lot of that is mindset. I keep on thinking that when I moved here, there are people who are retired and they want activities. And I'm going, I don't want activities. I want meaning. And I just simply moved my business down here. And I have no intention of stopping for the next 15 years.
Good for you. And I think, first of all, that's kind of, I think, key And, the other thing I think that's interesting about the 20th century, I think this underlines a lot of the challenges we've got. We established this 3-stage life of education, work, retirement, which sort of worked for a 70-year lifespan. But the other thing we discovered in the 20th century was the degree to which age is malleable. And, by that I mean you can influence how well you age and how long you live for. Now, obviously genetics matters, and, a whole bunch of things beyond your control also influence it. But, your diet, your exercise, your community, your relationships, we know all of these things make a difference. And I think that's kind of the other interesting thing, because if you are engaged, have a sense of purpose, and are forward-looking, then you do tend to age better, most of the evidence shows. So how do we create this new, longer life when the 3-stage life talks about you retire, you lose your work identity, and the danger then is, well, how am I engaging in the world, and what is my sense of purpose? And that's why I say, we talked about teenagers being this interesting experiment in the 20th century. You can see at the beginning of the 20th century, concerns about hooligans and yobs, and not quite sure what to do with this age group. And then eventually you sort of get things like the Boys Brigade or the Boy Scouts, which is sort of stick them in uniform, give them some discipline. Then a bit later on, you get the sort of the Bobby Soxers, which is kind of what parents would like the teenagers to be. And then James Dean wanders along, and it's like, that's teenagers. And I think that sort of decade-long social experiment is sort of what's happening right now. And I say everyone at whatever age they are is living longer than the past generation. They've got more forward time. They've got to be more forward looking. But it doesn't come automatically. You have to have that sense of engagement and purpose. And that is a challenge when many of our social norms say 50, you're an old worker, you can't work. 65, you're retired, you can't work. So we do need to find these ways of being engaged. And it's not just about work. It's about using your time in a way that gives you something back. And that could be strenuous hiking, it could be charity work, it could be starting up your own company, or getting a paycheck through a firm. But I think that's that interesting experimentation, similar to teenagers in the first part of the 20th century, that is happening. And actually, like teenagers, it's a period of change. One of the concepts I discovered in writing the book is what anthropologists call liminality. And liminality is a sort of the bit in between when you're doing a transition. It's when you're no longer what you were and you're not yet what you're going to be. So teenagers kind of is a period of liminality, because you're no longer the child you were, but you're not yet the adult you're going to be. And it's both exciting because all sorts of things are possible, but also terrifying because who am I? What is my identity? And we've created a whole culture to help teenagers through that transition. And I kind of feel we need to do that both throughout life, but particularly around retirement, where many people are losing one identity and saying, well, what next? And there's loads of different options. The question is, which one is going to be yours?
I think this relates to, I think it was Jill, who was your third subject in your book.
Jane, but yes.
Jane. Okay. And she graduates from college and probably doesn't get her first job until she's 30. I think she marries Jorge, and who is her peer. And every 15 years, they take turns reinventing themselves. And that's a foreign concept from what I was raised. I thought I was going to graduate from college and go work for a company for 30 or 40 years and ride off into the sunset and retire.
Yeah, and I think this is both the exciting and the daunting thing about these longer lives, because, 3-stage life, you didn't have to make many transitions. You're both because of the working world and technology was different, but also your lifespan was different. So one career and one industry would probably see you through to the end. So you kind of learned everything by 20. You formed your key relationships at that age, and that then saw you through the rest of life. And in, of course, a shorter life, you make commitments. In a short life, you make commitments early. But a longer life, it's important to keep your options open. And this sense of reinvention, either because you want to do something different, because it's just a long time doing the same thing, or because you're forced to do something different because you're laid off from work, is, I think, one of the challenges of a longer life, that need to reinvent yourself to keep adapting and seeing your life as multiple stages. And, it occurs at all sorts of different ages. One of the things I'd say when I'm talking about the book, if I've got a bunch of mid-40-year-olds in the room, I point out that they're probably going to have to work financially into their early 70s, which means they've got more work to go than they've done already. And that kind of is a good way of making the point to that group. And they start thinking, oh, wow, I need to do things differently. So it's a sort of every single age that need to sort of reinvent yourself. But it'll be hard because we encourage teenagers to experiment and to be flexible, and we're forgiving about their transitions. We're often not for people who are of an older age.
Yeah, I commonly tell the story of January 1, 1960. In Arizona, there was a great visionary named Del Webb. And on January 1, he launched Sun City with 5 model homes and a strip mall. He had 10,000 cars drive in the first day. And I always ask people, how many of those folks do you think smoked who drove in?
Yeah.
Probably most of them.
Yeah.
Right? And so they probably lived 10, maybe 15 years longer. Today, I think if you're a married couple, 65, there's a really good chance that one of you will live past 100.
Mm.
So are you going to play golf for 35 years?
Absolutely. And it's a long while on the golf course. I'm not a great golfer, but that to me seems even too long. And I'm not sure you will have a good long life if all you do is play golf. I mean, I don't want to be too prescriptive because everyone gets their sense of purpose and community in different ways. But the UK pension was introduced in 1908. And since then, life expectancy has increased by 36 years. And we haven't really changed too much the 3-stage life, which is crazy. And I think, one of the things, again, that I think we get wrong and where the ageism comes in, the fact we're living these longer lives, I think most people think we're older for longer. But I said, really, we're aging better. Biologically, we're aging better. So we are actually younger for longer. And in some sense, most of these extra years of life have come at the sort of second half of middle age. But, if you look at the gains in life expectancy, so about the last 100 years, roughly every decade, life expectancy has increased by 2 or 3 years. And that's like, saying at the end of every day, here's another 6 to 8 hours. And if you think, if the day went from being 24 to 32 hours long, we would structure the day differently. And, if it was me, I'd probably get up earlier and go to bed later. I'd probably have a sleep in the middle of the day. I wouldn't have 3 meals. I'd have 5 meals, hopefully smaller meals. I'd still call some of them breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but they would change their timing and what I would have for them. And I have introduced 2 new names for the additional meals. And I would probably work in the morning and play in the afternoon. In other words, with more time, I would structure my day differently. And that's exactly what's happening with these longer lives. We are structuring our life differently. And it's not about end of life. It's about all of life. So people now, the average age of marriage in the US, whereas in the late 60s, the average age of first marriage was around 20, it's now about 30. In the UK, and I'm sure similar in the US, you're now more likely as a woman to have a baby in your 40s than under 20. We've seen the number of people working after 70 triple in the United States over the last 10, 20 years. So we're seeing these really big changes in behavior right the way through the life course. And you talked about your father. My father was the same. They lived a 3-stage life and they kind of knew what was set out for them. This current generation at all ages are saying, I've got to do things differently. And if you're 20, and you mentioned Jane, the character from our book, if you've got 100-year life expectancy, you probably do have to think about working to your late 70s, early 80s. And of course you're going to do things differently if you've got a 60-year career. Of course you're not going to rush into relationships, commit to a career for the rest of your life. You're going to experiment, find out more about yourself, find out what you like and what you're good at and what you value. And that's going to be a really important part of your adult development. But similarly, in your 40s and 50s, or your 60s and 70s, because there's more life to come, you have to think about investing, exploring, and keeping options open, and thinking about how your personality changes. It gets a little bit Buddhist-like, because in a longer life, you're going to go through several different stages of who you are. Your identity will no longer be so closely tied to the one job that you've done for 40, 45 years. And that's kind of both liberating, but also a bit scary, because you're then going to say, well, my 30s, I did this. In my 50s, I did this. In my 70s, I'm doing this. But what is the thread that makes it your life? And there has to be some sense of values and growth that connects all the different stages. And if you've got that, then I think you also have the sense of engagement and purpose that tends to lead to healthier, happy, longer lives.
In my opinion, it's all about mindset and how you view getting older. It's interesting. I've got my online community now. I've got almost half of my online communities over 60 and a third are over 65. And one of the common themes is they all want freedom. They all want to keep on working, but they want to work on their term.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure how much of that is about the life course or just a basic human instinct, because I'm forever told that Gen X and millennials want flexible, meaningful, purposeful, autonomous work. But as you said, that's not just the Gen X millennials. It's also those who are over 60. We all kind of want that. And if we're going to be in a position to get it, we're also probably going to age better as well, because we know that that sense of autonomy and engagement is a key part. But I think, the other thing to me about mindset, and I could completely agree with you, I said earlier that age is to some degree malleable. It's something you have to work on. It's a recursive thing. So at every age, thinking about preparing for your future self is important. And I think that's the key mindset perspective. What am I going to do in the future that's different from now? And how do I make sure that I'm fit, healthy, engaged, and got my community and my sense of purpose? And that's a very open-minded mindset that the traditional three-stage life has not encouraged in that third and final stage. But in a longer life, you've got to be aware that you've got more time to come than the past. So you need to be more forward-looking. And, although you and I both in this talk have said, 78 is the new 65, that's true in an actuarial sense. But, of course, the really fundamental thing is 78 is just the new 78. It's not a 65-year-old 78 because you've got 13 more years of life, but you've perhaps got the health of a 65-year-old. And I think it's reconciling those two things that makes it so exciting at whatever age you are, that you're kind of younger than your age, given these improvements in biological age. But, 78 is just the new 78. 65 is the new 65. There are new options and new possibilities. And looking around and seeing what everyone's doing is fun, but you are a social pioneer. No one's really known how to live these longer lives. So we're all trying to work it out as we go along.
A few years ago, I had a former employee who turned 40. And she was lamenting on Facebook. And I said, well, but 40 is the new 30. And she then responds, then what's 50? I said, 50 is 50 until you turn 50. Then it becomes the new 40. And one of the things I've seen is if I talk to a 25-year-old and they start talking about saving for retirement, I said, you do realize that you're not going to be able to retire until your 80s. And they go, what? And I said, well, you're going to live to 120. Oh, I don't want to live that long. I said, oh, by the time you reach 60, you're going to want to live that long.
Yeah.
And that was one of the discussions I had with Ashton Applewhite, who wrote This Chair Rocks, is the older we get, the more young we feel, or the longer we want to live, or our view of old age keeps on moving further and further out.
Yes. And I think, so there's this literature on the paradox of aging, which is that, younger people look at some of the challenges of being older, losing mobility, etc., things that, even though we're aging better, still affect us, and say, well, that sounds terrible. But then, of course, you find that happiness does not decline as people get older. In fact, it often increases. So it's sort of, how do you reconcile those two things? And there's interesting literature there. And it does seem to sort of come down to some sense of innate wisdom about how to manage the shocks of life, but also how to manage your life so you get fewer shocks, and to help you focus on the more positive things that motivate you. And I think, that surely is the point of a healthy, long life, which is to know yourself and to know what is good for you and what is bad for you, which creates that sense of happiness, which then hopefully means you want to just keep on going for longer. I do think, one of the challenges we've got with these longer lives is that, there is evidence that as people get very old and they sense that, they may be approaching their final decade, they do want to concentrate and focus on the things that matter the most to them. And, that may have been 65, 50, 60 years ago when you started to do that, but it'd be ludicrous to do that at 65 now. You've got to keep your options and open and be investing in the future. So I do think one of the challenges of these longer lives is as you start to hit your 80s and your 90s, when do you stop being totally forward looking and start to get that blend and looking back as well as looking forward? And I think that's kind of one of the interesting psychological things we have to deal with as we adapt to longer lives.
One of the things that Ashton Applewhite talked about is the fact that as we've gone through the 20th and 21st century, we tend to segregate more based on age. Retirement communities, you're supposed to move into a nursing home. When you have kids, because of two-earner parents, you put your kids in daycare. And it's interesting moving down here to Mexico. There are so many of these multi-generational homes. And we know from all the research into blue zones that that's really healthy. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree. I think it's a shift towards chronological age, where governments then started to say, this is when you're young, this is when you're of working age, and this is when you're old. So governments then started, once they had a measure of chronological age, to segregate us by age. And, this is obviously particularly strong in the UK and the US and Western societies, less so elsewhere. And that's led to, a form of age apartheid, as Mark Friedman says, and less intergenerational mixing, which is not good for us. We know intergenerational mixing is good. I think it's interesting how, particularly in the US, that's also led to this obsession with generational labels. Again, for most of human history, we've never bothered with coming up with phrases like baby boomers and millennials and Gen X. We've just had young and the old. But at the same time as we started to measure when people were born and how old they were, at the same time as society started to become age segregated. In America, you see the creation of these labels, the silent generation, the golden generation, right the way through to, Gen Z or Alpha Gen, whatever it is these days. And I think that's because the generations don't mix. So the old then wonder what the young are like. And so they get obsessed with what Gen X are like or millennials are like. And you get these ridiculous sort of almost demographic horoscopes, demographic astrology saying, millennials like avocados or Gen X are, doing this or not doing that, which is absurd because people are just people. But I think it comes about because of a lack of intergenerational mixing. And recreating in these longer lives that intergenerational mixing seems to be crucial, both for the young and for the old. My only sort of challenge with some of this is that I think a lot of people in this space rightly point out the age stereotypes and the ageism that there is. But if you're really going to do that, then you can't cling on to the positive age stereotypes and just get rid of the negative age stereotypes. And to me, the key thing I know is that people are people, and millennials, baby boomers, some are the same and some are different. So some older people are very wise, some are not. Some young people are wise, some are not. But certainly, your journey through life gives you a different perspective, and getting the generations to mix together is a great way of spreading knowledge and insight and helping the young be more forward-looking, but also helping the old be more youthful and more innovative. So encouraging greater intergenerational mixing, I think, has to be crucial. And it is a real challenge. We've got a society that in so many ways is getting more and more stratified by income, as by education, as well as by age.
Yeah, there's no question that we self-segregate. And I just did a talk back in Austin on this whole concept of ageism. And I said, how many of you have networked with millennials? And they go, oh, nobody. And one guy said, well, he volunteered for the Beto O'Rourke for Senate campaign, which was in Texas. And he says, wow, did I learn a lot? And it's like, okay, that's a really good idea.
So this is, we talked earlier about transitions and change. And this is, I think, and you talked about mindset, really important thing. So on our website for the 100-Year Life, www.100yearlife.com, there's a simple diagnostic, because in the book we talk about how you need to keep investing in your assets, and your assets are not just your financial assets, but your skills and knowledge, your physical and mental health, and your relationships, as well as your ability to undergo change. And a 3-stage life did not encourage many transitions, particularly for men. You went from college to work to retirement, 2 big transitions, and that was it. So your identity was very much based around your work. And it's interesting looking at the diagnostic results from our website, because we've had about 20, 30,000 people do it now. And when we first started looking at the results, it was interesting because we couldn't find any pattern by age. And then we realized, actually, that's the message. People are the same. Whatever age they are, they still want to be doing education. They want to be doing active things. There really wasn't much difference across the ages, apart from one, which was a tendency for people my age, I'm early 50s, particularly men, to have quite narrow social circles. And by which I don't mean small, but kind of similar. So if you want to go through a transition, you've got to open yourself up to new people and new ideas and put yourself in new circumstances. And that's difficult, because in doing that, you're no longer the person that you're comfortable with. I have a great bunch of friends. They're all about the same age. They're all similar minded. We get on really well, but I'm not going to learn much from that group. So to learn a new idea about what I do next, I have to find a different group. But then when I turn up in that different group, I'm no longer Andrew Scott, who's the expert on economics and longevity. I'm just someone. And you feel out of place and you feel uncomfortable. And having the sort of the patience and endurance to get through that sense of being uncomfortable, that sense of liminality, is really, really important. And I think that's the challenge with the intergenerational mixing. It's nice to mix with people who are similar to you because they know you and you know them. And that's a great source of happiness. But you do also need to put yourself into these more challenging and different situations where your identity may not be so well defined. But that's how you get the growth and the learning and the rebirth.
Yeah, it's getting out of your comfort zone. I want to be respectful of your time. If someone wanted to learn more about your work and buy your book, and how might they do that?
Well, thank you for the suggestion that they might buy the book, 100-Year Life. There'll be another book coming out quite soon. There's a website, www.100yearlife.com. And then for my ongoing work in this area, there's also my personal website, andrewscott.global. This is a great topic. There are millions of people around the world living different lives, trying to experiment and learn from one another. My website has some of that, but also links to other sites like yours where everyone is just trying to share information about what could be.
Well, thank you for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
My pleasure. Fun talking.
I personally got a lot out of listening to this episode again, particularly about how we change as we age and our need to acknowledge that. I know I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago when I started Career Pivot, and I'm not the same person from before the pandemic. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. I recently published my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. While there, don't forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll also find me on Twitter at Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-298. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. This podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of the Repurpose Your Career podcast.